Welcome everyone to New York Housing Conference 47th Annual Awards Program. Thank you for joining our panel discussion on how to undesign the red line in New York. My name is Rachel Fee. I'm Executive Director of the New York Housing Conference, and I'm looking forward to moderating today's discussion. I will be joined by Sham Manglik, Senior Program Officer at Robin Hood Foundation, John Sanchez, Bronx Community Board 6 District Manager and candidate for Council District 15, Michelle De La Uz, Executive Director, Fifth Avenue Committee and New York City Planning Commissioner, and Dr. Raymond Winbush, Professor and Director of the Institute of Urban Research at Morgan State University. Thank you all for being here with me today. Today's panel discussion, it was inspired by our 2020 Public Service honoree, Designing the We, for their Undesign the Red Line exhibit, which has allowed communities across the U.S. to better understand our nation's history of housing discrimination and facilitate discussions on reversing and repairing this history. Let's hear from the creators, Braden Crooks and April DeSimone, to kick off the program.
Designing the We launched in 2015. And as a research and design firm, we wanted to take this work to another level. We really wanted it to focus on equity and inclusion within the built environment. This is all intentional. In order to understand where we are today, we felt that there needed to be a space or tool that really can articulate how systemic inequity, structural racism, all these terms that we're hearing came about.
All our challenges are deeply entangled in essentially the same history. And by telling the story of that history, we can actually start to chart a new way forward. We work with historians, we do a lot of research, but we are designers. And so we decided we needed to take a design perspective to this history. Redlining is how structural racism and inequality gets designed into cities. And it's never been undone. So to undo it, we actually have to undesign.
What was really interesting was section 3 of the timeline, where we've broken it up into 4 different components. Era 1, for example, on the timeline is separate and unequal. And what does it mean to be separate and unequal in this country and this history? Things that have always stood out for that timeline, for me, is just this momentum that's building of subhumanization in America, and really creating this space of othering, and whether you're deserving, even when we come with policies, it's are you worthy to even have them? In era 2, we now go into more of the historic New Deal policies, the various housing acts, but then it begins to show this momentum of how the geographical footprint of America takes hold. It wasn't that redlining and racism didn't exist prior to the New Deal, of course it did, but now it became codified. And now those who are put in positions of power to steward the ideologies and principles of our democracy are making decisions that have shaped the geographical footprint of America with hyper-segregation and gross inequities until this day.
In era 3, we're still separate, we're still unequal, and we're getting worse. So we've taken this financial disinvestment which comes from redlining, the declining property values, the difficulty in getting business loans, and now we've layered on public disinvestment. So you see policies like planned shrinkage lead to disinvestment in schools, hospitals, libraries, parks, street cleanup, trash pickup. Now we start physically destroying the city through the consequences of these policies, while people are still trapped and still living in these neighborhoods. In era 4, we recognize, okay, we're in a crisis. And you see a push from the ground up. You get community gardens, churches getting involved, the Community Reinvestment Act, right, which is going to lead to community development corporations and a lot of the work that we see in communities today. But you see a very, very different response from the top down, when politicians of all sides are going to say, no, the answer is we need to crack down. And by getting tough on crime, we're going to bring the city back to normal. And that leads us right up into where we are today, because this leads us right up into the crisis of policing, the crisis of mass incarceration, the quote-unquote cleaning up of neighborhoods that investment is starting to pour back into. And we're seeing a new wave of displacement, new wave of housing affordability crisis, new waves of homelessness crisis. And the question is, how are we going to break from that?
I think the exhibit really gives us a space to say, how can we do things differently? How can we, for once, come together and understand the lived experiences that human beings are going through and say, enough. And this is what we want for America. Housing is housing. And that's where we need to start from, is that we all need shelter, and it shouldn't be based on me deserving it or not deserving it, particularly if we really understand the history of where it's come from.
New York City has the opportunity to really lead on this work of repairing and healing this history. And the conversation in New York has really shifted over the past 5 years to focus on this as truly one of our deepest, if not the most critical crisis to deal with. And what we also see in New York is a ton of innovation. Movement with community land trusts and community wealth building, with community organizing and community justice centers, right? All kinds of amazing projects that are going on here, coming right up out of the communities and neighborhoods of our city that I think will inspire and change the whole country.
Now it's obvious why we are honoring Designing the We this year at our annual awards program. It's really such inspiring work, and for anyone that's seen the exhibit, it makes you think about how we can change things in our own city. So I want to start with Dr. Winbush. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of this exhibit in sparking dialogues regarding restorative justice and housing policy?
Well, thank you, Rachel. Well, I enjoyed the whole exhibit simply because of the fact that it's rare that you see the system of racism discussed. You usually talk about the behaviors of people within that system of racism. And so from the beginning of the exhibit, all the way back to enslavement, all the way up to housing right now, redlining was just a part of the system of racism. And the exhibit goes into that in depth. It explores the things that it's connected to, how racism is connected, not only housing, but bad nutrition, issues about education, where the housing was built, and the lack thereof. So I enjoyed it very much because I think, people can have a comprehensive view of how racism has informed a lot of what we do in housing in this country.
So I'm going to come back to you a little bit later and hear more about how it kind of fits into your work on reparations and how some of our conversation today could fit into that framework. For the other panelists, I'd really like to hear from you. The conversation that Designing the We is trying to spark in this project is really about, how do we undo discriminatory policies in housing, in lending, in planning, and the impacts they've had on communities of color. So I want to start with Sham, just to, hear from your perspective at Robin Hood. I know you do a lot about thinking of disparate incomes and how to change those outcomes, especially for children and families. So let us know how does your work fit into this?
Yeah, and thank you so much for having me. So for more than 30 years, Robin Hood has been working to end poverty in New York City. We're the city's largest poverty fighting organization, and our data, partnerships, and collaboration with organizations that serve low-income communities have really enabled us to quickly find, fund, and scale solutions that have shown to be effective. Through our grant making, we meet urgent basic needs and help people regain stability. And then through our nonpartisan policy advocacy, as well as our grant making, we strive to remove systemic barriers that underpin poverty, like racism and economic injustice, with the ultimate goal of helping households achieve sustainable mobility from poverty. Now, we know that the effects of racist policies like redlining are still felt in New York City today. Research shows that living in a high opportunity, low poverty neighborhood in childhood results in better outcomes as an adult. But for a number of reasons, low-income New York City renters often have no choice but to rent in areas of historic disinvestment. Research from the Furman Center shows that most privately owned, publicly subsidized affordable housing is concentrated just in a few neighborhoods in Upper Manhattan, the South Bronx, and Central Brooklyn due to the high cost of land and development. And then this concentration of poverty is reinforced by dynamics like eviction. So in support of our mission, we work with Columbia University to produce what's known as the Poverty Tracker, which is a longitudinal study of poverty and disadvantage in New York City. Last year, Columbia released a report on forced moves and evictions that found that evicted tenants often end up moving to neighborhoods where poverty is more common than where they were living before, further concentrating disadvantage in the city. The study found that before eviction, only 10% of evicted households lived in high poverty areas, and this percentage more than doubled to 26% when households were forced to move. And so I think a clear way to think about this is to think about what's happening and what has happened in gentrifying neighborhoods across the city. I think most of us know people who have been longtime residents of neighborhoods like Crown Heights, who due to a formal eviction or perhaps more likely illegal harassment tactics, have to move only to find that the only place they can afford is a neighborhood in the Bronx or somewhere else that's far away from their social supports, networks, and their kids' schools. And so I think something's really lost when our policies don't do enough to counter these longstanding patterns of segregation and further concentrate poverty. And as we, face a wave of evictions due to the pandemic and we look to a new presidential administration, I think it's really critical that Robin Hood, policymakers, housers take proactive steps to promote policies that actually expand the ability of households to rent affordable rental housing in the neighborhoods of their choice, and especially high opportunity, low poverty areas.
Hearing that we're not doing enough right now, that we have not got it right. Michelle, I'm going to turn to you first. How do we begin to undesign the red line in New York City? Like what does that mean to you? Where do we even get started on tackling these disparities in wealth and opportunity through housing policy and planning?
Well, the first thing that I think we need to do is we need to be intentional about that being our goal, right? I think a lot of where we go wrong is that there's either a trickle-down approach to these things, or we think, well, that if we have growth, then of course equity is going to follow, but that's not the case. We know that the city is going to grow and change. It always has and it always will. The question is, who's going to benefit from that growth? Who's going to benefit from that change? And we should always be asking ourselves and really applying an equity screen to growth and change, especially growth and change that is facilitated through public processes like the land use process, or through tax abatement, or through any government action, right? We should always be asking ourselves, what is the public getting in exchange for this public action or this public investment? And certainly that's what Fifth Avenue Committee has been trying to do in Gowanus as part of the Gowanus Neighborhood Coalition for Justice, which is a coalition of local public housing leaders, affordable housing advocates, industrial advocates, and civic leaders that want the Gowanus area-wide rezoning that the city is planning to certify in January of 2021 to advance economic, social, racial, and environmental justice. Gowanus is a neighborhood that used to be predominantly Latino, but as a result of past land use actions and other policies, went from a predominantly Latino community to predominantly white community. It's in a community board where the AMI level, the area median income, is well over $100,000, which is significantly higher than the area median income in the city as a whole. And yet, over 4,000 residents that live in public housing live in third world conditions. And that's been tolerated by all of us as New Yorkers. And if we know that this area-wide rezoning is going to result in significant value that will accrue to private owners, to private developers. And Fifth Avenue Committee partnered with the Pratt Center for Community Development to do an analysis of exactly what that value is, called Public Action, Public Value. And we propose that that value should be captured through a public value recovery mechanism and invested into local public housing developments that have over $200 million of capital need. So, that kind of approach, that kind of intentional approach is something that should happen in those questions, and that analysis should be done in every neighborhood-wide rezoning that the city sponsors. And there has to be a review. So, who has been left out of opportunities? And how can we use this particular action to rectify that situation.
So we're going to come back to some of these issues that you've brought up, Michelle, when we hear from other cities on the call today. I first want to hear from the Bronx. So, John, from your perspective, where do we start? What does undesigning the red line mean for New York City for the first, the next steps? Michelle talked about intentionality. Where do you start?
I think, first, thank you for having me. I think the first way we undesign the red line is to look at those areas that were shaded green, that were ripe for investment from the federal government, and ensure that they have affordable housing built there. We have parts of this city, such as Riverdale, Soho, parts of Queens and Staten Island, that prohibit more than single-family homes from being built. And we need to reverse undesign the red line by putting housing there, instead of just focusing on low-income neighborhoods. There's no area in New York City that should not have affordable housing. And I don't care if it's filled with wealthy people, they need to do their fair share and have affordable housing there. We're seeing this fight right now in Soho. We're seeing it in parts of Brooklyn. I work at a community board where people make $26,000 a year. The challenges we face are a lot different than people concerned about shadows and preserving the facades of buildings. People are concerned about having a place to eat. People are concerned about having heat and hot water. People want to make sure they can get by. So when I hear these concerns about neighborhood character, or our infrastructure can't hold this many people, I'm very skeptical. But I think the first step is to make sure that wealthy neighborhoods are providing affordable housing. That's the first step.
Dr. Wimbish, I see you smiling like you've heard some of this before. Unmute yourself and jump in. What's your reaction to hearing this?
Well, I'm always impressed how the system of racism can come up with euphemisms about itself. So, we have undesigned the red line. We also have things like, I wrote down a few of them here: racial disparities, educational gap, unequal justice, health disparities. And all of this stuff is really racism. And I don't want to sound cynical, but we've tried so many ways throughout American history, which again makes sure undesigned the red line, captures in this exhibit. But we've got to really understand the resiliency of racism in making these things stay intact. So we've tried 40 acres and a mule, if you want to go back that far. We even created, this country created another country called Liberia to say, well, maybe one way of housing Black people is to send them back to Africa, and created a country to do that. We've tried open housing laws. And the amazing thing is that racism always finds a way to get around some of those things. I mean, some people call it critical race theory, that it underlies almost everything that we do in this country. So I think we've got to talk about, John just said, we've got to talk about how some of the things that some people are talking about, facades and things like that, are absolutely irrelevant. I live in Baltimore, and people will talk about things that are so irrelevant to what the people that I deal with, poorer people, have to deal with every day of their lives. And I think that we've got to talk about the resiliency of racism, how to thwart it, that it's going to rise again, and will thwart many of our efforts about redesigning, or I keep saying redesign, undesign the red line.
We're going to redesign some new policies. I think we have some ideas of where we could start in New York, but I also think it would be great at this point in time, when we have a mayoral election going on and this opportunity to really, reset housing policy, think big about our solutions, be intentional, to hear what other cities are doing and can we learn from them. We have some other cities that have some advice for us, some initiatives that they have underway, and we're going to start with a message from Chicago, from the National Housing Law Project.
Hello from Chicago. Here in Chicago, we decided to tackle the problem of aldermanic prerogative, what we saw was that aldermen in predominantly white neighborhoods were blocking affordable housing developments in their wards. We documented these findings in a report called A City Fragmented, and then filed a HUD civil rights complaint with HUD's Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity, arguing that aldermanic prerogative violates the Federal Fair Housing Act. While we are working to settle that case, we've recently learned that the city of Chicago will no longer permit local aldermen to block applications from developers for affordable housing dollars on the basis of aldermanic prerogative. Can the example we set in Chicago undesign the red line in New York?
So thank you to the National Housing Law Project, Kate Waltz, for that message. I know that John has a lot to say on this, but I'm going to go to Michelle first and just ask you the question. Is this the case to eliminate the city council deference to local members on land use? Or, I mean, what do you think about what they're doing in Chicago? And is there any case for New York?
I think obviously in Chicago, they were able to establish a pattern, right? That there was a pattern going on, and that pattern led to continued segregation. I think, what's interesting here with councilmanic deference, the whole issue of councilmanic deference is a bit of a double-edged sword, right? On the one hand, we want to make sure that local communities have a voice in planning. And we want to make sure that the elected representatives are making sure that that voice is heard. The issue is if you have a pattern where in majority white neighborhoods, the council member is able to block affordable housing, and majority communities of color where the council person feels manipulated into having to accept development which may contribute to displacement. And so that's certainly the latter is what has been going on most recently in the city of New York, right? Where most of the neighborhood-wide city-sponsored rezonings have been happening in lower income communities of color. And the bargain that the administration had with the local council member is, if you accept this change, then you're going to get investment. Whereas the investment should have come regardless of change, right? Because that was what was always needed, and the neighborhood had been ignored or disinvested in. So that's the challenge. I mean, reality is that it's the administration that also, at least for the majority of the large rezonings, it's the administration who's choosing which neighborhoods are getting rezoned, right? It's not the local council member, and one individual development isn't necessarily going to move the needle on integration. So the message has to come from the leadership, from the executive leadership and the elected leadership, saying really what John said earlier, which is that affordable housing and integration and having a racially and socioeconomic diverse city is everyone's obligation. It's every neighborhood's obligation. And so we can't put up barriers to ensuring that we fulfill that obligation. And certainly the cities where we live, Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Plan talks about this in terms of ensuring that every community board in the city has at least 25% of the housing is affordable housing, rental housing is at least affordable. Right now, that mark is 46%. So we're not even at a 50% mark in the city of New York. So we have a lot of room for growth. And certainly moving forward the right way with the Gowanus area-wide rezoning and moving forward with the Soho rezoning I think leaves a more appropriate legacy for the de Blasio administration than how they started with area-wide rezonings.
John, let's hear from you on this next. What are your thoughts?
I view it very simply. If a council member wants to create more housing in the city of New York, it makes sense to defer to them. But I'm not going to defer to someone that wants to promote exclusionary policies that keep people that look like me from living in areas, no matter where that area is. I also think we just need to be honest. There's always going to be a bottom 10 to 15% of the population where a $500 a month rent will not be affordable for them no matter what. So I think the foundation is, yes, we need to build more housing, but what do we do for that bottom 10 to 15% where no matter how affordable the units are, they just can't afford it without government help. And I think what the Biden campaign has been pushing, making Section 8 an entitlement, is the way to go. Everyone that qualifies for Section 8 should be able to get a voucher. And we also need to make sure that landlords are accepting these vouchers, and we need to be investigating them and prosecuting them if they're not. And with that said, if universal Section 8 vouchers goes through, there's estimates that this would reduce poverty by 0.25%, by 25% actually, which is amazing. So I think it's twofold. One, that bottom 10 to 15% of the population, we need to give them rental assistance through vouchers. But then with all of these people with vouchers, we need to make sure we have enough housing built for them. The short answer is, I think member deference in its current state is flawed. And I don't subscribe to a member deference policy in which we're allowing wealthy neighborhoods from preventing housing from being built there. And also, last thing I'd say is that, as Michelle mentioned, most of these rezonings have been pursued by the mayoral administration. I think council members should be proactive and identify areas in their neighborhood that could be ripe for housing. Be specific. I'm all about specific policies. If you don't have metrics and you don't have locations, it's just a bunch of buzzwords.
Can I just say though, it's interesting, the member deference, at least right now in Gowanus, I think is working to our benefit, right? Because we have two council members, Councilmember Brad Lanner and Councilmember Steve Levin, who are pushing for an equitable and just rezoning, right? They have made it clear to the administration that unless the administration comes to the table with a significant investment for public housing, that they will vote no, even though there are many things in the rezoning that they like, right? And that they fought for. So that's, in this case, we'll have to see how it pans out. We haven't even started the official formal process, but in this case, I think the council members have been fighting very hard to advance equity and inclusion.
And we're seeing that play out differently in different neighborhoods though, right? It really depends on how engaged that council member is, how they're engaging the community. Are there kind of those trade-offs that you can negotiate it as well? In Soho and Flushing and Sunset Park, it really is kind of rolling out in a different way in each neighborhood. I think what we should do is turn to Minneapolis, who actually took maybe like a little bit of a bigger picture approach and getting at some of the broader solutions, John, that I think you're kind of looking at and we've discussed in equity planning, and Dr. Winbush, you're pointing to is, sort of like we have to go bigger. So let's hear from Minneapolis and how they approach an equity framework.
Hello from Minneapolis. Through our city's comprehensive plan, Minneapolis 2040, we are dismantling little-known land use rules that were designed to and effective at segregating our city by race and income. First, the Mapping Prejudice Project had to reteach us 100 years of history white Minneapolitans had conveniently forgotten. White Minneapolitans used threats of violence and court-enforced racially restrictive covenants to segregate our city by race. We used our zoning code to reinforce and preserve that segregation. In 2017, civic leaders explicitly stated that a core goal of the Minneapolis 2040 plan was to eliminate our city's racial disparities. They bravely named that every single neighborhood in Minneapolis, especially the wealthiest, whitest ones, has a role to play in making space for more neighbors. They stated clearly that no matter the intention of us as individuals, the ordinances of our city have excluded people because of their race, and we must change those rules. After a multi-year, multi-language citywide engagement process, it was clear that Minneapolis residents share a vision. We see also the status quo voices heard at public meetings do not represent us. We do want our city to eliminate our racial disparities. Among Minneapolis 2040's many policies, one legalizes small multifamily homes anywhere in our largely single-family city. We're now reforming the 1,000+ pages of our zoning code as part of living up to our shared vision to end our racial disparities. How can the example that we set in Minneapolis help you to undesign the red line in New York.
So we just heard from Minneapolis. They certainly call out racist policies as such. They're not dancing around there, Dr. Winbush. I'm just wondering, so there's two parts, I guess. One is kind of an equity framework that really shows the intention. And then two, where it led was, allowing accessory dwelling units. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Well, I really like what Minneapolis is doing because it shows how they are going to the heart of the problem. They have codified racism in their whole housing policy for many, many years. And when she said that they're going through what impressed me when I saw the video the first time, that they're going through 1,000 pages to make sure that the codified racism that was embedded in Minneapolis is wiped out. And they're involving the entire city, even the all-white neighborhoods. So this is how you undo racism. It can only be undone if people are willing to tackle it head on, especially the part that is codified. You can call it systemic racism, whatever, and they're doing something about it. So I really like what they're doing in Minneapolis.
John, I'm curious about the accessory dwelling unit piece and your thoughts in the Bronx.
Well, I completely agree that there should be accessory dwelling units throughout the city. And it makes sense, especially for lower income homeowners in the Bronx. They don't have large backyards in the suburbs, but they do have a basement. They may have a garage, helps them get some extra income, but it also provides more homes for people at a cheaper cost. And people should know, especially in the Bronx, there are a lot of basement apartments that are illegal right now, where people are living in fire hazards and no ventilation, no windows. People have died. Why not bring these places up to code, help the homeowners out and provide more homes? I think it's a no-brainer. And then especially when you think about places in the city where people have massive backyards, why should we deny them the opportunity to provide a new home? And if they want the city support with it, they need to make sure that it remains an affordable unit. But I think it's a great idea. Other cities are doing it. And once again, it shows that when it comes to housing policy, New York City is behind the rest of the country.
So Michelle and Sham, I'm curious about your ideas on an equity framework. Could that be a new housing plan? Is it, identifying the high opportunity neighborhoods for rezonings, or where would you start?
Well, those two things that you mentioned, I think, are certainly a good place to start. There's obviously pending legislation to do racial impact statements as part of rezonings. That is certainly a very good place to start. We could rewrite and update our environmental review law and manual so that it properly captures both direct and indirect displacement risk so that it can then be mitigated against. It doesn't.
And you're talking about legislation that Public Advocate Jumaane Williams put forward, which is looking at requiring racial impact studies for any rezoning in the city.
That's right. That's right. And but also the existing City Environmental Quality Review Act, for every major private application or citywide sponsored rezoning, the environmental review process has gaping holes. So we could start by also capturing what is the value that is being created as opposed, for every action, that we were all very, very clear about that. We can make sure that that we're currently, capturing properly the secondary displacement risk, that we understand that rent regulated housing isn't as safe as it's represented in the environmental review process. I think those things are all possible. I would also say that in the report, Public Action, Public Value, that Pratt Center did with Fifth Avenue Committee, there's an equity framework in that document that I think would also be valuable to review. And it has a lot to do, it's really a series of questions that you need to ask yourself, right? And similar to the ones we talked about, which, who is gonna benefit from this particular action? Who has not received investment? Who's been left out of past actions? Where are the disparate impacts that we talked about, so that, again, going back to the intention piece, so that you can make sure that those are the people, those are the communities where opportunity is created.
Sean, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that historically, the cities thought about measuring success in terms of affordable housing by measuring and counting the number of new units that are created or affordable units that are preserved. I mean, that's effective. New York City really leads the country in terms of affordable housing production, but I think we've seen that what we're doing so far isn't really doing anything to counter these patterns of segregation and the legacy of redlining. So I think the next administration should really think more broadly about this. Where is the housing being created? Is it in areas of opportunity? What is the affordability level? And do existing tools or new tools that are under consideration actually enable families and individuals to take advantage of these opportunities and truly have housing choice?
Yeah. Dr. Wimbush, any thoughts before we turn to Seattle?
No, I'm really waiting to get to Seattle for a number of reasons. I'll hold my comments till then. Okay.
Okay. So now we're going to hear from Seattle.
Hello from Seattle. We in King County, like in much of the rest of the country, are struggling with increased segregation by income and by race. This is a core issue for us in terms of displacement, in terms of gentrification, in terms of the kind of social equity and racial justice issues that we're attempting to address. We're using two interrelated strategies to try to tackle this. The Housing Authority back in the 1990s started to buy up Class B multifamily housing on the private market. We issue municipal bonds to finance this. When we buy this housing, we can't drop rents, but we only raise rents as our actual operating costs go up rather than as the market rises. Over time, these units become increasingly affordable compared to market. A two-bedroom unit in a complex we bought back in the 1990s now rents for some $450 less a month than an identical unit in an adjacent development. We also use these developments as friendly landing pads for housing choice voucher holders. At this point, of the 6,000 units that we've bought, some 15% of those units are occupied by Section 8 voucher holders, creating true mixed income in gentrifying communities. We couple this with an aggressive approach to geographic mobility for our housing choice voucher program. Here we've created a locally designed Section 8 program which shifts subsidy levels to reflect different submarkets. We do this on a zip code by zip code basis. Giving folks adequate subsidies so that they can actually procure housing anywhere they want in the county is critical. We've now married that to an aggressive counseling program where we work with landlords and we work with tenants to help them find and secure the right housing. We've been doing this in partnership with Raj Chetty and the Opportunity Insights Project and trying out a variety of different counseling methods. What we found over time is that those folks who have our counseling, 54% of them find housing in the areas they want, in high opportunity areas. Only 14% of the control group have been successful. These two strategies working in tandem have resulted in some 30% of the extremely low income families with children that we house living in high opportunity neighborhoods. Let us know if there's something we're doing out here that can help you with unredlined New York.
So first of all, I love this guy, but I don't want you all to think that all the good ideas are just happening in Seattle because he's from New York. Steve Norman is from New York. So we're going to have to bring him back and do like a follow-up where we find out more about what they're doing. Because I mean, it really seems like not only does he have incredible results, 54% of his voucher holders in, living in the neighborhoods they want to live in is how he describes it. But, that really can have profound impacts on a whole generation of children if that's to scale. So I'd love to hear your thoughts. Sham, do you want to lead on this one?
Sure. And, as Steve mentioned, and I think I alluded to before, landmark research by Raj Chetty found that young children whose families used a housing voucher to move from a high poverty to a low poverty neighborhood had better earnings and educational attainment as adults than kids whose families didn't move. So in theory, housing subsidies increase mobility and help voucher holders access private market housing in a variety of neighborhoods. Unfortunately, there are a few things going on in New York that reinforce residential segregation and make it hard for families to actually have that level of housing choice. So first, voucher payment standards for federal and local housing subsidies are set at levels that just fall far below median rents in New York. This makes it incredibly competitive for families to find an apartment to rent, period, let alone an apartment in a low poverty, high opportunity area. So there are a few things that can be done to counter these dynamics and expand opportunity. I think one big thing that we could do is increase the payment standard for the city FEPS voucher, which is a commonly used subsidy for people who are looking to exit shelter. So right now with city FEPS, you can rent a 2-bedroom up to about $1,600 a month, but that's lower than the average median rent in all 5 boroughs. Before COVID in Brooklyn, the median asking rent for a 2-bedroom apartment was $2,500 a month. And in Manhattan, this was closer to $4,000 a month. While rents may have dropped a little due to the pandemics, the subsidy levels are still at a place where it's virtually impossible for families to find an apartment in a high opportunity area. There are other tools that could be used more widely here, like small area fair market rents or FMRs in the Section 8 program. So these increase the value of a voucher in a high opportunity area so that a family can actually rent there. As Steve described, strategies like small area FMRs plus mobility counseling really have impressive results and can lead to success in terms of families moving successfully to areas of higher opportunity. And this could certainly be employed at scale. I think it's important to be aware of some of the trade-offs with that right now, because as was mentioned earlier, housing subsidies like Section 8 right now are not an entitlement and funding is limited. So if small area FMRs were to be scaled and used more broadly, ideally this would come with an increase in appropriations from the federal government or converting the program to an entitlement to make sure that the same or a greater number of households could be served. I'll also add that, with the expansion of mobility programs, the supply of available rental housing is still a potentially limiting factor in terms of the number of households that can be served. The pandemic may create unique opportunities for New York to expand the supply of housing, kind of in similar ways to what was done in King County. The other thing I wanted to mention is that even though source of income discrimination is illegal in New York City and state, it still happens all the time and is a major barrier for families that are looking to access housing with a voucher. It can be really hard to detect source of income discrimination, especially in tight housing markets. And so one of the most effective tools that can be used is to conduct paired testing that is run by groups like the Fair Housing Justice Center, which is a Robin Hood community partner. They first work to identify instances of discrimination through these tests and then partner with legal services providers to open up housing opportunities to voucher holders. We've provided them with funding to ramp up their testing operations in high opportunity areas with the goal of expanding housing choice and promoting mobility. We're also partnering with the Fortune Society to kind of do the same thing for formerly incarcerated individuals. I think programs like this, plus increased funding for source of income discrimination enforcement, could have a really big impact and are some proactive ways that we can take steps to counter the legacy of redlining.
Those are some good points. I mean, you can have housing counseling, but the discrimination piece is definitely a harder one to get out and pervasive throughout our city. What else is speaking to you about Seattle? I think their anti-displacement strategies are really interesting too, and how they're, really competing with the private market in acquiring what's kind of naturally occurring affordable housing and waiting it out, and over time having, those really great stats to share on affordability. Is that something we could do in New York?
Well, that's what the Neighborhood Pillars program proposes, right? So Fifth Avenue Committee and other nonprofit CDCs, advocated for the city to create the Neighborhood Pillars program, which was really to buy multifamily properties to help preserve affordability. Then the rent laws changed in Albany, and then COVID hit, and everybody at the Office of Management and Budget was like, I'm not so sure this is a priority right now. But it's the difference between taking a long-term view versus taking a short-term view, right? Like, we've had an affordable housing crisis in the city of New York for decades. It's not going to go away unless we are intentional and invest in long-term solutions. And that includes taking, purchasing properties and helping to preserve their affordability for the long term, rather than let those move into speculative hands, which we know, especially in downturn situations, right? We have predatory investment that comes in, purchases those assets, and then either in a short term or lays in wait for the appropriate moment in time to then pounce and displace people. Like, now's the time. If we're going to be serious about affirmatively furthering fair housing, then we have to put our money where our mouth is and make the investment.
That's right. Dr. Winbush, you were eager to hear from the folks in Seattle at the King County Housing Authority. What appeals to you and what the work they're doing?
I think what appeals to me most is the counseling part of it. Clearly it's effective. He said 54% achieved housing with the counseling, and the control group 14%. I'm not so sure, and again, that it's going to be effective. I mean, he kind of touted the fact that the average house is $450 less per month on rent. But in a city like New York, I'm not sure that's going to make that much of a difference because the rents are so high. So it would seem to me that they would have to do something to, have a greater, hold the rents down, but do something else to subsidize. And, for me, it's reparations. And I'll tell you what they're doing in Evanston, Illinois, about some of that stuff. But I'm okay with him. And since he's your friend, I won't say anything else.
Okay, we're going to come back to you on what is happening on reparations around the country. I'm going to just let John, if he wants to comment on, either the displacement strategy or, how they're using Section 8 vouchers in Seattle.
I think is great. I think having mobility choice is important. I'm just educating people about what their options are. But I just want to highlight, I was just looking up some data. The community board I work in the past 10 years, we were in the top 10 of housing unit production per 1,000 people. We were in the top 10. And when I looked at the data even more, there are 10 community boards which produced half of the units in the last decade in New York City. Mm-hmm. And it goes back to the first point where there are too many community boards in too many areas that just aren't doing their fair share of producing housing. We had high job growth pre-pandemic for the past 10, 20 years, and housing growth didn't keep up. If every neighborhood was building as much housing as Community Board 6, we probably would have less problems. But you have some neighborhoods, and I'm going to name them because we need specificity. We have in the Bronx, Morris Park. We have Riverdale, we have Bronxdale, we have, and then I'll go to Brooklyn. We have Bay Ridge, we have Bensonhurst. Then I'll go to Ridgewood and Maspeth. There are too many parts of our city where neighborhoods, for reasons that we probably know why, they don't want to have dense housing. And I think that's the foundation of the problem. We can't have 10 community boards shouldering half the housing load in this city. That's not a sustainable land use policy.
What do you think the solution is? Is it kind of a fair share policy? Is it, an administration who's coming in with an intention and really using, political capital to try to, make some of this happen? Or like, what do you think the solutions are?
I think one, we need a mayor that has a specific numeric goal and a specific numeric goal for neighborhoods throughout the city. But I really think we need the state to get involved, to set region-wide goals, because we're talking about New York City, but there are places of Long Island right now near the LIRR train station that do not permit housing, affordable housing to be built there. So I really think we need to think of it from a regional perspective. And I think we need our legislators in Albany that represent New York City, which is the majority, to step up and say, here are our goals for the state, and we need to hit these goals, and here are incentives we can provide. And I mean, that's something that President-elect Biden is talking about, providing incentives for municipalities and states that are getting rid of exclusionary practices and providing them more funding for housing. We need to have a carrot and stick approach.
And, I think also of this moment where we have, potentially 30,000 households in New York at risk of eviction, right? You have tens of thousands of households with rent arrears accumulated to a degree that they will never pay them back, right? They have no ability. It will ruin their credit. We haven't seen what we need from the federal government yet. We will keep advocating. But we do have, we had an affordable housing crisis already in New York, but we have really a serious crisis at our feet. And so I think bringing in some of these ideas about like, how do we think more broadly about our regional housing needs? How do we think about fair share issues and building in every community board is really going to be an important part of the solution coming out of this crisis. So I want to come back to Dr. Winbush now, who, his academic work and I think his personal passion as well have intersected in this call for reparations. And so I'd love for you to talk about like how undesigning the red line in New York, some of these strategies, some of the things we talked about today kind of fit into that framework, and how are other, places in the states thinking about it? Like how, there's some momentum. So tell us a little bit about, what we can learn from those other places.
Well, the one that I would point you to for me is Evanston, Illinois. Robin Rue Simmons, who I call the Rosa Parks of the reparations housing market. She has done yeoman's work, and she did something very simple. I think sometimes when we talk about reparations, we want to kind of skirt around the edges. It's like if you read Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, that the monster was created, then ultimately it destroyed the village and everybody there. Well, I think that's what has happened with racism. We've done, over 400 years of having racist policies, and now we have to undo them. We don't have to, but we're trying to undo it. So what she did was go directly to it. They are all the marijuana tax. Marijuana is now legal in the Evanston, is going to a reparations fund for African American people, period, and specifically housing. And the way it works is that, and I've been involved with that $25,000 is going to any family who has had experiences or their ancestors from 1919 to 1969 with racism. And the redlining was all over Evanston, Illinois, which is, as you know, right outside of Chicago, which has been declared the most segregated city in the United States. The $25,000 then, when the family gets it, they can purchase a home, period, wherever they want, purchase a home. And if they stay in that home for 10 years, they don't have to pay that loan back. It's a radical approach, but it's working. If you already are a Black homeowner, you can still get $25,000 to fix up your home, enhance it, put what did you call it earlier about a subsidy so that you can rent it out, all of that. And see, I think that I see racism as a radical approach to disenfranchise people. I've always seen it that way. And I think we need radical approaches to enfranchise people. And I think that Alderman Simmons has done that. Evanston. California right now is the first state that is going to be looking, they're still in the talking stages of what reparations are going to look like for Black people in that state. And even Burlington, Vermont, last week just set up a reparations commission as well to do it. So I think that you got to look at radical approaches. I really think that you can snip around the edges and look at it, but you really have to look at radical approaches. And I think the city of New York has to design programs where residents can get money with the counseling that was discussed, like in the gentleman in Seattle, to how to buy housing. I always tell people, Black people have only handled our own money for the past 150 years. White folks have handled it for 500 and even longer than that. And so counseling is necessary. I think that's very important. So I'm calling for, and several of us, more radical approaches to actually give money to people with counseling. And that has worked with many Native American groups that I've worked with. I could cite the example of the Tohono O'odham people in southwestern Arizona that I did some work with them a few years ago. It has worked. And I think that that's what they're going to have to do in New York, because New York, one of my colleagues, I asked her in New York, she works for the housing authority, and I can't cite her name, but she said she thinks that people in housing in New York, in public housing, ought to be free to not pay any rent whatsoever, no matter if it's $30 a month or $500 a month for a period of 5 years. Put that in an escrow account. And the money that they have, even though it's a small amount each month or a larger amount each month, use that to do some other things. And then she says that you can use that money to purchase homes or even to move out of the city of New York altogether. I don't have time to talk about all of these, but I think, again, look towards radical approaches to undo some of the things that have been done in New York.
So radical approaches is what we need. And,
you got to think outside of the box. Yeah.
Yeah. And, I do think we're at this moment with, a new president in the White House. I mean, the first that has come in with a housing plan, right, that looks at centering it on equity, on climate change, saying, we have a supply issue, we need to build more affordable housing, and we really need restorative justice in, people who have been excluded from the homeownership opportunity in the past, right, to offer, there's, potentially a new tax credit at the federal level. So, I mean, those are kind of like the big thinking, large scale solutions. And at the city level, I mean, New York is investing, more than any place in the country in affordable housing right now. But, are we kind of making the right investments, and are they benefiting those who need it, or should we be really looking at a different framework of being more intentional about that and who benefits? Shem, I want to start with you. In closing remarks here, just kind of like thinking about 2020 being in the past, looking forward to 2021. What do you want to see in terms of restorative justice and housing policy?
I'll just expand on what's already been said, but again, I think we just really need to think beyond unit counts that served a purpose, but it's not really meeting equity goals. Really need to think about the placement of housing, multiple approaches on how that goal can be achieved, and then have it be explicit in the next mayor's housing plan. And then also promote sort of a more expansive federal housing policy. So, we've talked about making Section 8 an entitlement. I think that would be hugely transformative for housing choice in New York City, and also in terms of reducing poverty.
Absolutely. John, what are your thoughts?
I want the next mayor and the next city council to encourage housing development across this city in all neighborhoods. I want us to get rid of outdated land use rules like M1 districts that prevent any housing from being built whatsoever. Manufacturing is not going to come back to many parts of New York City. Let's update that. I'd like to see ADUs available all throughout New York City. I'd like to get some state help on that. And I think what everyone kind of is thinking is we need the federal government to step up. A lot of these big policies can't be done just on the state and city level. We'll see what happens with Congress, but making Section 8 an entitlement will probably be the most significant thing a president has done in this country in 30 or 40 years when it comes to housing.
Absolutely.
I think that would be the game changer. So that's what I'd like to see in 2021. And lastly, I want to see council members be proactive when looking at development rather than being reactive to developers coming to them. No, examine your district, know the block and lots, look what the zoning permits, and be proactive with the administration rather than just waiting.
Michelle, final thoughts here?
I think we need a comprehensive housing plan that looks at housing preservation and development, public housing preservation at the same time, and also homelessness. I think part of the problem is that we have different people trying to solve the same problem. And if they all saw it as a common problem that needed to be solved and maybe all reported, I think there's a big piece of this is that we have different agencies working on common problems, but they're not really thinking about it comprehensively. So I think that would be a big piece. And then quite honestly, so we also need to invest in people. The more that we can help skill people, the more that we can help invest in their education and work skills, the more that we won't have to solve the problem on the rental subsidy side and instead can just help people access better paying jobs. And that's a really important piece as well.
So Dr. Wimbush, I'm going to let you have the final words as we close out this discussion. I think some change on the horizon, and I think, this opportunity, and I even want to say optimism that everyone is feeling going into 2021. Your thoughts on how we can be doing it better in New York.
Well, first, I think, and I'm very serious when I say, I think that you should bring in Robin Rue Simmons from Evanston. Her work is transformative. And I think years from now that she's going to be going down in history of this country as really marking a turning point about how reparations can help housing and to help those who are not only homeless, but those who have been discriminated against in housing. That would be one thing. Secondly, I think that the exhibit itself, it's got to, and I know we're under this pandemic, but everybody needs to see that exhibit. It's wonderful. And I've seen almost every interpretation of racism in this country that exists practically. That's the best one. And I'm not just saying that because all of you guys are here. It's a good one. So because I think Americans aren't educated enough about their own past. Ta-Nehisi Coates talks about the idea of Americans living on a set of myths about itself, and that exhibit dispels some of those myths, not only about housing, but just in general about what, and I said, I'm not going to mention the guy in the White House today. I swore that I wasn't, but it dispels a lot of myths. And people need to be educated about that. So hopefully you'll be able to take that exhibit all over the place. I'm going to give it a lot of publicity in the work that I do and encourage others to see it. It's great.
Yeah, I think you're right that confronting our past is the way to move forward and really thinking about restorative justice and housing policy, what it can look like, what it needs to look like, and what it can mean for changing lives. And I think I want to thank you in particular, Dr. Wimbush, for bringing in this framework of reparations, because I think for us housing nerds, like we really think about policy in some of these silos that Michelle described. And I think it's really important to think about, who has been discriminated against and who we need to create policy for, and really think about moving our next housing plan towards restorative justice. So I want to thank everybody for being in this discussion with us today on undesigning the red line in New York City. Thank you so much.